Hey, this is Mohal Joshi from Los Angeles, California. I follow Indian foreign policy and defense with a special focus on Asia. You can follow me on Twitter at Mohal Joshi.
Hey, this is Kishor from Bengaluru in India. I am an international relations expert specializing in global security, conflict resolution, and international negotiation. My focus areas include peace building and digital diplomacy. You can find me on Twitter at Veggie Diplomat. Hello, and welcome to episode 36 of India Rising Strategic Affairs Conversations with Mohal and Kishor, a show in which we analyze the happenings from around the world and their impact on India. Before we begin with today's episode, we just hope that our friends in Afghanistan are safe during these uncertain times. We kind of woke up to the terrible news of the bomb attack in the Kabul airport on the 26th of August. With just about 5 days left before the actual US pullout from Afghanistan. Now, this suicide bombing, the attack per se, happened at the Hamid Karzai International Airport. And as per some reports, there were around 182 people killed, out of which around 169 were Afghan civilians and around 13 from the United States Armed Forces. Now, the Islamic State Khorasan province, ISKP, claimed responsibility for the attack. The next day, the US carried out a drone counterterrorism strike on an ISKP planner in Nangarhar province to kill suspected terrorists. The US military also conducted a drone strike on August 29 against a vehicle it stated was believed to be carrying at least one ISIL-KP suicide bomber in Kabul, who was trying to reach Kabul airport to attack it. Now, however, to everyone's dismay, it was found that the relatives of the dead said that 10 people belonging to the same family, including 7 children, were killed due to the airstrike. So again, it was a retaliation that went haywire. As per report, some of those killed had previously worked for international organizations and also held visas allowing them US entry. So this is kind of, again, one more example of US intelligence not being trustworthy enough. Time and time again, we have seen this happening. And eventually, at the end of the deadline, on the night of August 31, Major General Chris Donahue, the commanding officer of the 82nd Airborne Division, boarded the final flight, a US Air Force C-17, which ended the 20 years presence of US forces in Afghanistan. This, according to Taliban, meant that the foreign occupiers or the foreign powers had eventually and finally vacated Afghanistan, and this was time for Taliban to start ruling Afghanistan all over again. Now, Mohal, with this background, with this backdrop, can you explain more about what and who are the ISKP?
Yes, Kishor. So the ISKP, or like the Islamic State Khorasan province, is not very well known, especially before these events, to many of the listeners. So the Khorasan in ISKP stands for a generic term, which is basically the area covering what is modern day Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. So the ISKP began as a group in 2015 that was made up of former Tehrik-e-Taliban fighters who had fled Pakistan operation in the tribal areas. The ISKP cadres are like an odd mix of disgruntled elements from various terrorist groups, such as the Taliban, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, commonly referred as TTP, and Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and they also have some foreign fighters from the Uzbek, I think it's called the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan or something to that effect, and also some foreign fighters from India. So it's like a whole mumbo jumbo of all kinds of disgruntled people who have joined ISKP.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before we delve deeper into the ISKP, one thing to note is that all of these Pakistan, Afghanistan connected extremist groups are certainly a complex set of characters. They can, on one hand, like have ideological differences and yeah, like I mean, openly waged conflict with each other and like try to hurt each other or kill each other's fighters. But then on other times, mysteriously they are working together. Like I mean, an example is the Gurudwara attack that happened in Kabul in February of 2020.
Right.
And then, I mean, this is also the reason for this are like complex. I mean, many of them are mixed in due to their tribal ties and origins, which many times are bonded by uh, like deep ties by either blood or by marriage. So these complex interconnects makes it sometimes figure out hard to figure out like who is on which side. I mean, which maybe a fighter was in group X today, but maybe now is in group Y. Sometimes it makes it very hard to identify which group they're associated because they could be changing loyalties very soon. I mean, many times it's just due to like personal rivalries or clashes with the leadership or maybe even ideological differences.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as to like maybe who is the more hardliner and that due to that reasons many times the the fighters would be changing their positions
Yeah, maybe if you're
now.
not, maybe if you're not hardcore enough, then possibly I might go fight with another person against you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so the ISKP and Taliban have had differences in the past. As I said, the
Mm.
ISKP has criticized Taliban's willingness to negotiate with the US, including the 2020 Doha agreement. Now, back in mid 2015, the Taliban leadership, when the ISIS first rose, had asked the ISIS supreme leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi to not form a parallel jihadist group in Afghanistan to challenge the Taliban. Now, the Islamic State back then had responded publicly with a statement criticizing the Taliban and declaring it a nationalist movement and decrying its founder like Mullah Omar. So I mean,
Mm.
there have been like some differences where like the ISKP is more a cross national movement, while
Mm.
the Taliban is more localized just to Afghanistan, mostly.
Right, right.
So, like in an article recently by the Laurie Institute by Amira Jadoon, Andrew Mines, and Abdul Sayedis, they write that, and I quote, ISKP views the Afghan Taliban both as its strategic rival in a saturated militant landscape and as an ideological opponent. It smears the Taliban's efforts to form an emirate based on national boundaries, which is directly opposed to the Islamic State version of a global caliphate. Additionally, the ISKP deems aspects of the Taliban's ideology and governance practices as heretical, framing itself as the only legitimate jihadist actor in the region. In part, violent attacks such as those on Kabul airport are meant to distinguish the ISKP brand from the Taliban's, cast doubt on Taliban's ability to govern and provide security, and signal their own resolve to various audiences, all of which can ultimately increase terrorist organizations' longevity and serve as a recruiting tool. ISKP also uses these attacks to paint its longtime Taliban rival as an illegitimate collaborator with the West, incapable of delivering security to the Afghan people. End quote. So I mean, this is like an interesting point that the ISKP says like, okay, we are the true hardcore followers of the ideology, and like the Taliban is like not following it to the letter of the law as per them. Now, I mean, as Taliban, I mean, we haven't seen much evidence of Taliban becoming moderate, but let's see if they become moderate in the future for more political recognition and more financial assistance,
Mm.
then it will just give an ISKP an opportunity to brand them as diluting their core principles just for money, and is bound to attract disgruntled followers from the Taliban towards the ISKP. So, I mean, this is the blowback that the Taliban could face. That on one hand, they have like a more extremist organization on the in the form of ISKP, but also on the other hand, they cannot dilute their brand so much that they start losing followers to the ISKP.
Right. So in a way, this is kind of similar to the way Muslim Brotherhood evolved within the Middle East, where they kind of rose up against the various dictators in Syria, Lebanon, Libya. I mean, basically, they said, to hell with your nationalism. You are keeping us shackled just to make sure that you continue to remain the dictator of this land. And looks like Taliban and IS are also waging a similar kind of a battle out here. Taliban is more nationalist, just focusing on Afghanistan for now at least. And you have IS who do not believe in nationalistic boundaries. They merely vouch for the caliphate, and they obviously do not agree with whatever Taliban is doing. Yeah. So yeah, I think that is a good drawdown on who or what ISKP stands for. But then I think we also need to understand, Mohal, of did ISKP do, carry out this bomb attack all alone, or was Taliban complicit in it? So again, as you mentioned, they have no love lost for each other. And ISKP commander himself was killed by the Taliban during the recent takeover for the country. And it was clear from the attack at the airport that either the Taliban was complicit in allowing these attacks to happen or was simply unable to stop it. So, I mean, you cannot tell that the Taliban was totally unaware of the situation or anything of that nature. It had to be, it's clear that the Taliban had to be aware of ISKP in a mood to carry out such vengeful attacks. Now, again, anybody who tells that Taliban can assist in counterterrorism has to be joking. I mean, there is no two ways about it. Indian journalist Rahul Hassan Lashkar had quoted that around 600 ISKP fighters and their families surrendered after a campaign by Afghan security forces in Nangarhar in November 2019. So this was about close to 2 years back. Among them were Pakistanis, Tajiks, Uzbeks, Iranians, Maldivians, and even Indians. Now, no prizes for guessing who freed them from jails in Kabul recently. Obviously, it was the Taliban. So again, this kind of bonhomie when needed and fighting when not needed is kind of the way these two groups or these two organizations operate. And we continue to see such illustrations and such instances over and over again. Former raw intelligence officer Anand Arni said, and I quote, "Something not quite right here, bit too sophisticated for ISKP. Multiple targets, motivating and moving two suicide bombers, manpower, logistics, safe houses, local assistance, explosives, crossing security barriers, all this happening within Kabul." So this raises a lot of red flags as to whether Taliban was aware or not, or were they actually willing to turn a blind eye towards all this. Kabir Taneja, fellow at ORF, and also a first post analyst and author, he said, and I quote, "There are questions about the Kabul attack. By all accounts, a city teeming with Taliban and the Haqqanis, both experienced entities. One main road to the airport, again teeming with checkpoints. The Talibs stopping people everywhere, foreigners carrying out daily reports, and still we find the ISKP infiltrating with guns and bombs." So again, more and more questions being raised. Sushant Sareen also exclaimed, and I quote, "Until 2 weeks back, the Taliban were doing precisely what the so-called ISKP is doing now. Overnight, Taliban have been transformed into knights in shining armor who will save the world from the terror of ISKP. Get real. ISKP is being grossly exaggerated to extract Western money," unquote. So again, people are skeptical, people are doubtful of how and to what extent were the Taliban complicit in all this. We need to wait and watch as to what is the real picture. Moving on, Mohal, I want you to actually talk about this new war on terror 2.0, because now everyone is telling that everyone is kind of forming opinions that the Taliban are moderate, whereas the ISKP is the actual deal. They are the actual hardliners, and we need to cut them to size. So, can you talk about the new war on terror 2.0?
Yeah, so many believe that in the future, the Taliban could possibly be co-opted by the West as in the new war on terror against even more radical groups like ISIS or ISKP. Now, one could see in the statements from the Western elites that there seems to be an attempt to, tone down the image of the Taliban or make them more acceptable in the West. I mean, you could see that. I believe it was the CDS of UK who had mentioned that, oh, the Taliban are just nothing but just country boys.
Right.
So we could see that there are attempts subtle attempts being made, here and there.
I mean,
Now,
even in the universities, even in academia, we have found
Mhm.
this happening in the past couple of years, and it's just concretizing of the opinion over a period of 2-3 years. What we see now. Yeah, go ahead, Mohan.
Yeah. So coming back to it, basically there's a lot of attempt to like portray them in better light. Now, this could be simply to the fact. I mean, some people have said that there are a lot of citizens who are still stranded in Afghanistan even post August 31st, and the Western powers don't want to upset the Taliban in any way, shape, or form because like they could be held as hostages in that situation, or maybe it's just that there is some mainstreaming, for a lack of better term, of the Taliban, a new war on terror, or war on terror 2.0 could even see where West suddenly considers this Taliban as the proverbial good guys versus extremist groups like ISKP who would be now the proverbial bad guys. I mean, this would perfectly work into like the Pakistan's case where they could have even done the suicide bombing in against the airport to suddenly portray the ISIS in bad light so that the Taliban get a kind of a free pass. It's like a speculation on many people's part. I mean, even the chairman of Joint Chief Staff of Army, General Mark Milley, has said that it is possible that the US could coordinate with Taliban on strikes against the ISKP in the future. So
that could be a complete turn of the tables.
yeah, I mean that would be a radical 180-degree situation, Now, the Pakistan has been through many of these radical extremist groups, and as they have been able to milk money from USA and the West over the past few decades, like first with the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan between 17 and 89, and now for the last 20 years with the fight against Taliban and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan. Now, this new specter of threat from the ISKP could easily be overplayed by Pakistan to make sure that the largest that they have been receiving in this so-called war on terror, and I think they received up to $30 billion. So they would want more the money to not stop flowing, especially since they are under the FATF hardship with a lot of sanctions against them. So they don't want this money to stop flowing. I mean, they could just simply spin it. Okay, we are fighting this new radical group in the AFPAC region, which is the new biggest terrorist threat. Sushant Sarin recently wrote, and I quote, with decades of experience behind it, the ISI has mastered the art of manipulating and managing the contradictions and the conflicts between different terror organizations and using them for advancing security and foreign policy agendas of the Pakistani side, pitting one group against the other, using one group as a foil for the other, raising the profile of one group to increase leverage with another group, making rivals come together for a specific purpose, and then forcing them to go their separate ways is something the ISI is used to great effect in the war through terror strategy. Even the whole Taliban versus ISKP narrative first came out of Pakistan in quote. So I mean, there could easily be, Sushant Sarin very rightly said that they could just be. I mean, let's say if one group got out of hand, they could use another rival group to bring it down, or maybe even splinter the existing group to create trouble back at them. I mean, they are like shady stuff. They could do all kinds of shady stuff in this region to just make sure that their leverage doesn't go ever.
Mm-hmm.
So the battle for supremacy between various radical groups and ISKP is, uh, I mean, could be one of the reasons could be that like that as I said before, that the ISKP is myth that the Taliban have deviated from their ideology to set up a Islamic caliphate, and a terror strike uh, might be the way to show them their place, So I mean, the reason is, so the speculation is there, like with the Kabul bombing, that was it the ISI was sending out a message to both US and even the Taliban to not coordinate without the clearance of the ISI handlers in Pakistan, possibly. So that brings, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, perfectly fine. Possibly, would you want to elaborate on this Pakistani angle?
Yeah. So I mean, we have seen that there have been a lot of celebrity posts and messages floating on social media by various Pakistani handles and social media handles and people. I mean, despite that, like the Pakistani journalist Hamid Mir has claimed that the Pakistani people are not celebrating the Taliban victory. I mean, as per him, the Pakistani deep state would be extremely, on one hand, be extremely happy that it got rid of a Western government in Kabul, but also, uh, and I know gotten a pro-Pakistan dispensation installed in Kabul, but like they also would worry about what comes next. I mean, the aim of the Pakistan deep state would be to convert the influence that they now have in Kabul into the sort of leverage with the rest of the world, where they are the go-to or the middleman for the rest of the world for anything they want to deal with the Taliban and the Afghanistan. So Pakistan, I mean, this is a run of the mill where they would want to extract its pound of flesh for something they are mastered for the past few decades on how to get the Taliban to do something for the West and in return get some money or compensation for the same. I mean, Christine Fair, I mean, who has been in the news lately also, has very well said, like, and I quote, Pakistan has spent decades setting fires in South Asia and then expected praise and remuneration for offering to put them out. So, yeah, I mean, so coming to the Taliban and let me also cover a little bit in the Taliban and the ISI relationship. So during the past 20 years, the ISI and Taliban have had a symbiotic relationship. The Taliban needed sanctuary in the Pakistan for rest, recuperation, and recruitment of its fighters, and also providing the logistical supplies, which were like kind of out of reach for the NATO alliance inside Afghanistan. While on the other hand, what the ISI wanted was to have a force in Afghanistan which was not inimical to its interest in the region, and which gave its the fabled strategic depth versus India. I mean, the families of many Taliban fighters, including the senior leadership, were provided safe haven in Pakistan. So this also led to a unique situation where they were under duress from ISI, like because if they didn't do the bidding of their hosts, I mean, their families could be threatened or could be used as a pressure points. Now that the situation has changed, where like Afghanistan is liberated, like many of the Taliban fighters and their folks would be now across the Durand line in Afghanistan. So the question is, I mean, Rawalpindi and ISI pressure them to the same extent? Maybe not, maybe yes. I mean, there always been rumors that the ISKP has been infiltrated by ISI, and some factions of ISKP are close to both ISI and Haqqani network could be used as a leverage against Taliban in case the Taliban went out of line. I mean, the question also remains that how far Taliban is willing to Pakistan's line. I mean, Pakistan in the past has asked, I think, practically all governments in Afghanistan to accept the Durand line, which, knowing the history, I mean, no Pashtun is ever going to agree to, given their roots in history, across the Durand line. Now, the other question is also important for Pakistan is its internal security, right? So can the new Taliban dispensation crack down on the TTP elements operating within Afghanistan? Because one claim that the ISI keeps making that the Afghan security forces to get back at Pakistan used to harbor the TTP elements inside Afghanistan, who used to then launch attacks across the border into Pakistan against Pakistan armed forces. So now can the Taliban provide security to them? Or I mean, because some minister had just mentioned like that, oh, that is like Pakistan's problem. We have nothing to do with it. So that will be an interesting thing to note if the blowback from all these fighters of even the TTP being freed, like does Taliban crack down upon them, or they just like let them run free and they go create trouble in Pakistan?
And also because, sorry to interrupt, also because
Mhm.
Pakistan itself is struggling to get out of the FAT of grey list. It helps them to actually have these kind of proxy groups, and also have one proxy group act as a leash against another proxy group. And in all the confusion amidst all the milli, Pakistan can go scot-free telling we have nothing to do with all this.
Yeah.
And also when it comes to TTP, Pakistan famously keeps pointing fingers at RAW and IB, telling
NDS.
India is behind all these attacks. So yeah,
Yeah.
Pakistan can.
But
Uh,
now I mean, they can certainly blame RAW all day long,
mhm.
forever, but like they can't blame NDS, which is the Afghan Security Service, because now it is
Not
with
anymore.
the
Correct.
pro Taliban government. So
Yeah.
if there's anything coming across the border, it's like more failure of the Taliban government to crack down on the TTP elements inside their country.
Indeed.
I mean, also another challenge is like Pakistan wants no part of India in Afghanistan, including development projects, for reasons known to them. Like, I mean, because a development project would be kind of benign influence, but even like Pakistan is being so delusional, they even think that, oh, uh, Indian workers, like laborers, are like, oh, undercover Indian spies, inside Afghanistan. So, I mean, Taliban has made some statements that they're open to Indian investment. I mean, they have seen the $3 billion of
Right.
investment that has done much good. But I mean, obviously, India will be wary of putting any, I mean, I would say like boots on the ground in terms of the military sense, but like workers sending it out there because they would be easy targets for the Haqqanis, like they did in the 2008 Kabul embassy attack.
Mhm.
But also in general, that India would not want no investment in there. So, I mean, the Taliban might be wanting Indian investment, but Islamabad will want to have no part of it.
Actually, I was watching a Pakistani discussion on the internet, and
Mhm.
they kept harping on the point that India has far too many consulates within Afghanistan for such a small country,
Yeah,
and to which and with which India does not even share a border. So I mean that's obviously the Pakistani point of view, but yeah, they keep harping on it, telling why do you need so many so many how many consulates, what are you doing here apart from development projects? Surely you don't need so many consulates just to build a dam or just to build a highway. So yeah, that's how they look at it. Yeah,
yeah.
go ahead, Mohal.
Yeah, I mean, and also they will use the ISKP factions that are close to Rawalpindi,
Mm-hmm.
and also the Haqqanis to keep the Taliban in check in case the Taliban step out of control. And then lastly, the issue of Pakistan creating trouble in Kashmir. Now, Taliban, as we know, is more inwardly focused for their inside the country versus other groups like ISKP, which could have nefarious designs in Jammu and Kashmir and rest of India.
Mm-hmm.
Now, ISKP was implicated as having carried out the attack on the Sikh Gurudwara last year, with both of the gunmen being Indian citizens from Kerala.
Mm-hmm.
Kabir Taneja recently wrote that there have been a spate of cases inside India where pro-ISIS operatives or sympathizers have been caught in places like Delhi and Bangalore. Now the question is that if Taliban might not want to interfere in Jammu and Kashmir, the question is, can it control various groups like ISKP plotting attacks from its soil onto Indian soil? I mean, that's $1 million question. I mean,
Right.
Pakistan could easily leverage the Haqqanis inside the Taliban to plot attacks against Indian interest within Afghanistan. Now, see, the last time when Pulwama happened, like the plotters or the planners were, let's say, on Pakistani soil. So we
Mm.
still got them with the Balakot airstrikes. Now the question is if Pakistan might want to not claim that okay, nothing happened on our soil, whether where the next terrorist attack was planned, God forbid. So they would say, okay, maybe it was planned in Afghanistan, so it will become much harder because we don't have a direct land access border to anywhere in Afghanistan where you could just go bomb like a Balakot kind of situation. So they would more. I mean, Pakistan, while Taliban might not want to create trouble in India, but like Pakistan might use the lawlessness in Afghanistan to plot attacks, let's say maybe near the Afghanistan-Pakistan border to create trouble in India. So that's an open question on how it will work out. And I guess India will have to be prepared for all these contingencies or situations.
True. Okay, so we'll move on. I think I needed to point out about the final resistance in the Panjshir Valley and how it was broken and what it means. I mean, to the naked eye, it may just be one small part of the country where the Taliban was struggling to gain a foothold. But be that as it may, Panjshir had gained a legendary status because even 40 years ago, when Taliban were kind of coming in, they were unable to capture this territory. Now, what happened was the Northern Alliance back then were successful in keeping Panjshir out of Talib hands. Now, this time around, although the end result was not a surprise, the quick fashion in which Talibs overrode the resistance fighters, I think that was more of a surprise. But then, looking at it in hindsight, every other provincial capital fell quickly, and even the national capital, Kabul, also fell quite quickly. So, you know, in hindsight, I think this was a kind of easy to guess, and also the fact that the leaders of the resistance, Aman Masood and Amrullah Saleh, they were not even found in Panjshir. Eventually, they were found in neighboring Tajikistan, as per a BBC report. Now, why is all this important? Last time around, when the Taliban were in power, they had to have one eye on these regions, the northern areas, keep fighting against the resistance fighters, and also try to administer the rest of the country. But this time around, the entire country is in their control. The war is officially over, and this helps Taliban to completely focus on providing a brand new administration. So this, I think, will see Taliban purely as an administrative entity rather than as a warmongering entity. So I think this is where we need to understand how, or we need to see how Taliban will want to put up a face for itself to the outside world. Mohal?
Yeah, so I think couple of points like which is different to the 90s. So one point is that there was a contiguous land connection.
Correct.
That the Panjshir enjoyed to Tajikistan, so they could be supplied via ground through the Tajikistan. So Tajikistan and even Badkhashan, like this time, both areas are now under the control of Taliban. So they have truly been cut off from all sides, which makes resupplying them very hard unless it's done by air.
Essentially, essentially this time Panjshir became more of an enclave.
Yeah, it's like an island this time around because you think even like Mazar-e-Sharif, I think maybe it was under Taliban's control, but like some of the areas adjoining Uzbekistan and even Tajikistan, I believe, were under the Northern Alliance control, so they could still control the land routes coming in and supply them. The other point I wanted to make is that we saw those images that the capital of Panjshir, like I think it's called Bazarak, if I'm not mistaken, that had fallen, but the suspicion is that the fighters, the Panjshir fighters, have retreated to the mountaintops and they have left the valleys unguarded where the Taliban has taken over. So maybe the resistance has melted away into the mountaintops, from where it'll be harder to dislodge, while they're letting the valleys be occupied by the Taliban, which is the easier task. But there will be a guerrilla campaign fought from the mountaintops, but still the issue of getting resupplied with men and material would be a big challenge in the months and years to come.
And Panchir is actually a very weird topography. It is a 60-kilometer long valley with just three mountain passes to enter into. So unless and until you capture those three mountain passes, the Taliban will find it very difficult to stay in control of Panchir forever. And these tribesmen or the fighters who have fled to the mountains, they might actually find it easier to oppose and continue fighting, more like a guerrilla force rather than as an organized force. So I think, yeah, that's the new dimension that we will see about how Taliban will look towards administering. And that brings me to my next point of how Taliban announced a new 33-member cabinet this week. And if you look at the demographics of the cabinet, we have 31 Pashtun, 2 Tajik, and 1 Uzbek. Obviously, no women in the cabinet. And although many people thought that the Taliban were now a new or evolved organization, it's quite obvious that the Taliban doesn't think likewise. So yeah, even within those 31 Pashtun, we have 4 of the 5 ex-Guantanamo detainees who were exchanged for American soldier Bob Dagl, again, who was taken as a prisoner by the Taliban. And these 4 of the 5 ex-Guantanamo detainees now have senior leadership positions. Now, the 5th person is actually a governor in one of the provinces. 17 of these 33 cabinet ministers, more than half, are on the UN sanctions list. All 33 members are members of the Taliban. Absolutely no representation for any other groups. Although there was a lot of talk of power sharing during the intra-Afghan talks in the past year and a half, where there were talks that somebody from the Karzai or the Ghani government might actually be included in a power sharing agreement. However, the Taliban, I think the Taliban thought that since they got an absolute victory, they would have thought there is no need to include anybody outside the Taliban.
There's no incentive.
Absolutely. Now, again, the thing is, since all the hardliners came back to pick up plum positions within the government, and then we also had the immediate news of protests by women in Kabul, where the protesters were beaten up and the media folks who were covering the entire event were arrested. This kind of was a deja vu moment. When you have hardliners in the government, you have protesters being beaten up, you have media persons arrested. I mean, this is more of the same rather than any change that anybody wanted to see on the ground. So I think the outside countries would want to recalibrate their expectations simply because these people might want to continue where they left off. Maulvi Hassan Akund is the Islamic Emirate's new Rais-ul-Wazara, or the Prime Minister. Now, he himself, interestingly, does not have a power base of his own. Therefore, he does not pose any major significant threat to the leaders of the other 2 major factions. Now, which are the 2 other major factions? One is the southern faction, dominated by leaders hailing from the Kandahar region, and the other one is the eastern faction, led by Sirajuddin Haqqani, or the Haqqani network. So Hassan Akund, the Maulvi Hassan Akund, will pose no threat to either of the 2 factions. However, Hassan's 2 deputies, Abdul Ghani Baradar and Abdul Salam Hanafi, are again, they are from these 2 major factions. Baradar was Taliban's chief negotiator with the United States in Doha. In 2010, Baradar was arrested by the ISI, likely as a consequence of his decision to pursue independent peace negotiations with the United States, both in 2004 and 2009. He was released by the ISI in 2018, and eventually he began peace talks in Doha. So Mohal, the point that you were making, whenever Taliban goes awry out of the Pakistani script, Pakistan finds ways to bring them back under the leash. So I think that way, again, this time around too, when he was released by the ISI and he began peace talks in Doha, obviously it had the blessings of the ISI. On the other hand, you have former Taliban chief Mullah Omar's son, Mullah Muhammad Yaqub. Now he is the defense minister. Now, again, you also have the new chief of army staff, Qari Fasihuddin, who is also from the Badakhshan province, as you mentioned, Mohal. And he is from the Tajik ethnicity. However, although he might be from the Tajik ethnicity, he is pro-Taliban. And he helped in the complete takeover of the northern areas, including the Badakhshan province, which houses the Wakhan corridor. And therefore, people believe that he found the new job of being the chief of army staff. However, a point to note is he is close to the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic movement. What is East Turkestan? That is the Uyghur province in Western China. So a lot of points to be connected out here. Again, the most powerful person in the cabinet is not the Prime Minister Akin, but rather the Interior Minister Sirajuddin Haqqani. He, by getting that plum post in that crucial ministry, it is obvious that the ISI now wants to have complete control of Afghanistan. Obviously, the US were always asking that the Haqqani network has to be defunded, has to be de-rostered, and any support from Pakistan to Haqqani network has to stop, even for Pakistan to get out of the FATF grey list. But now, since Sirajuddin Haqqani is now in control in Kabul, it's yet another proxy for Pakistan within Afghanistan.
Like 4 of these, 17 or more than half of them are on the UN sanctions list, but like 4 of these carry a bounty of $20 million on their head. So imagine like 4 $20 million head bounty people are like running the government now.
Yeah. Now, moving on, Sher Mohammad Abbas Tanighai, the Taliban political office head, he recently met with the Indian ambassador in Doha. We'll come back to it later. And he mentioned that he wants good relations with India. Again, this kind of ruffled a few feathers within Pakistan because Pakistan didn't expect this statement coming in from the political head from Doha. Anyway, Mohal, you now want to talk about the Haqqanis and the TTP and the quagmire of allegiances?
Yeah, so before that, I just want to mention that in the last episode, we had mentioned about Akhundzada, the current head of Taliban. Now it is mentioned, so it seems that he is not occupying any political position. It seems that the Taliban is going to follow like an Iran kind of model where the religious leader is like kind of a de facto president or like a higher authority, where he would be probably just relegated. He would have the power to make the final decisions, but the day-to-day running of the government is left to the prime minister and the other cabinet folks, while he'll have a more ceremonial post, similar to like what the I forget like what's it called in Iran, the
Ayatollah.
Yeah, the Ayatollah in Iran. Okay,
there was also talk of Haybatullah not being at the best of his health, right? I think that was also a concern.
Yeah, that could be the case. They are always reluctant because of a lot of the repeated drone strikes where just took out a few of the Taliban leaders. They might not be willing to appear in public. There's also some funny photos on the internet where some of the key cabinet ministers have their photos with their backs to the camera and not even showing their faces. Okay, anyway, so one thing that Kishor touched upon, I wanted to elaborate upon, and so basically there was some differences of friction between the eastern and the southern faction. So the eastern faction is the pro-Haqqani faction that's near the border with Pakistan, and the southern faction, which is the more the Kandahar side faction. So there was some rumors that there was some disputes and fighting between the two factions during the formation of the cabinet. Now, what is being told is that because of this, the DGI, so the Director General of ISI from Pakistan, like Faiz Ahmed, was photographed in a Kabul hotel along with the Pakistani ambassador to Afghanistan. He had to come to Kabul to settle the dispute and assign the various posts, or maybe just smoothen over the process of who gets what post. I mean, as I mentioned before, the Haqqanis have been rumored to have helped in the suicide bombing in the airport. I mean, the southern faction believes that the Haqqanis have some relationship with some of the ISKP fighters who were earlier with TTP, and they have used this to put down just show their influence to put the southern faction at a bit of a disadvantage with this action. So how this dispute evolves between the two factions over the coming weeks, months, and years is something we'll have to wait out and watch whether it becomes a more bitter dispute between the two factions. I mean, with the possibility, I don't think there'll be a civil war, but there could be more infighting among the factions, or maybe they will peacefully coexist, or maybe coerced by the ISI to exist in a better. So not only this jostling for positions that happened between the eastern and the southern factions, but there are also some differences between the politicians and the military commanders. I mean, some of the military commanders who have fought in the battlefield are not very happy that many of these political people who had enjoyed hospitality in, let's say, Qatar or Pakistan are now dictating terms to them who have done the hard fighting on the ground. So there is a lot of, the Taliban might appear as a monolith faction, but there are differences and difference of opinions. So it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over time.
That's a good point. I think it's important to understand that Taliban itself is not a monolith, and there are multiple forces within pulling in opposite diametrical directions. Mohal?
Yeah. So moving on to another point is like, what's the international support going to be for this new cabinet? Now, many countries like US have mentioned, that the lack of inclusivity among the minor ethnic groups, and especially the women, gives a good reason not to afford any official recognition to Taliban. I don't think it was coming either way, but now this gives a good, I would say, excuse, for a lack of better term, to not recognize this government. I mean, there will be some recognition from certain set of countries, like, for example, Pakistan for sure, and Qatar, who help negotiate the Doha deal, and also Turkey would want to get some influence in this region. But what about the other players in the neighborhood? So Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, who are the literal next door neighbors to the north, would not be happy that the token representation of the Tajik and Uzbeks have gotten two Tajiks and one Uzbek. And I think the Tajiks and the Uzbeks do constitute, I think, something in the double digits. I don't remember the demographics in front of me. Have a substantial amount of population, so they are way underrepresented in this government. Iran, on the other hand, would be not happy at all, as there are no Hazaras or who are Shias represented at all in the cabinet. There's zero representation. Now, this is bound to deepen the fault lines within Afghanistan among ethnic lines, something which was seen even during the first Taliban reign between 1996 and 2001, where the Northern Alliance was mainly led by Tajiks and Uzbeks. I think even Hazaras were opposed to them. I don't recall very, very well. I mean, even in the Ghani and the Karzai government, one of the complaints that actually Pakistan was making sort of on behalf of Taliban, that the military dispensation was heavily in favor of Tajiks and Uzbeks, something that they didn't want. So now we could have a completely reverse situation where we could have an unbalanced formation in the other hand, where there could be a lot of Pashtuns, but not enough Tajiks and Uzbeks in the upper military and intelligence hierarchy. Another point we have to remember is that the Taliban, as per the Doha Agreement, has agreed not to let its soil be used for terrorist activities against US and its western allies, which are like thousands of miles away. But like, what about the nearby next door countries? I mean, next door neighbors of Afghanistan. They certainly don't want the spillover of violence and terrorism from Afghanistan into their own territories. I mean, let's say if these ethnic tensions, which I mentioned due to the lack of representation from the cabinet, becomes worse. I mean, this could lead to an insurgency and a possible. I mean, let's say there's an insurgency and a possible civil war. I mean, we are not sure because maybe if the Panjshir resistance is wiped out, then there would be no, there'd be hardly any token resistance against the Taliban. But let's say if it manages to survive and stays, has a staying power, then there could be a new civil war and insurgency inside. So now the Taliban would be forced to spend much of its energy in rooting out these uh, these rivals, I mean, vanquishing their rivals, rather than rooting out the extremism from Afghanistan, which could spill over into other countries. Now, if the internal strife is minimal, I mean, even if the internal strife was minimal, let's say, and they didn't have to spend a lot of energies on their opponents, the $1 million question is, will they be cracking down on various extremist groups threatening nations all over the world? I mean, as we saw in the late 90s, I mean, US made repeated requests to crack down on Al-Qaeda, but Mullah Omar and Taliban refused to hand over Bin Laden, even after the 9/11 attacks when they were presented with proof, and they said, like, oh, we are going to hand him over under any cost. So the question is, like, will they be able to crack down even if there's a civil war, even if there's without a civil war on this? I mean, what kind of guarantees the neighbors can have? Like, I mean, let's just talk about the immediate neighbors. Like, can Taliban guarantee that ETIM or East Turkestan Islamic movement will not create unrest in Xinjiang, China? We don't know. Can Taliban guarantee that TTP won't attack Pakistan armed forces in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Waziristan and all those areas? We don't know. Can Taliban guarantee that ISKP won't be creating trouble in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and even Russia? We don't know. Can Taliban guarantee that ISKP and Al Qaeda, Indian Peninsula, I mean the branch of affiliate of Al Qaeda, not carry out terror attacks on Indian subcontinent? I mean, we don't know. So like all the neighbors would be on edge and monitoring to see like if the Taliban can fulfill its promises, even though many of these countries, I mean, minus India, I mean, Pakistan, China, the Soviet republics, Russia, are happy to see the back of US after 20 years because they believe this is their own backyard. I mean, sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for, because if Taliban can control all these insurgent groups inside their country, I mean, it would blow back into their neighboring countries, you know.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so another thing that we need to talk about is actually the cost of running the country itself. Now, as everyone is aware, most of the Afghan reserves are held in the US. So the question of money to run the country is now an acute problem, and that is something that the Talibanis want to address at the earliest. The Chinese, from their side, have promised a loan or a grant, whatever you call it, of around $30 million. Now, this is peanuts when you compare to the few billions that the previous government spent every year to run the country. Again, running a country is a much bigger challenge than running an insurgency campaign. Now, the problem is, while Russia, China, and Pakistan are asking for normalization of relations with the Taliban too have made their initial moves by stating that China is their closest ally, claiming that China is, quote, ready to invest in and reconstruct Afghanistan, unquote. As much as it might seem natural for Taliban to side with China, this is also likely to backfire on the Taliban, since they are committing themselves too early in the game. And while the Chinese have promising loans, both with interest and interest-free types, there are so many preconditions like early recall, unilateral cancellation, etc., which are antithetical to the Hanafi jurisprudence on loan borrowings. So I think this is yet another possibility where the hardliners within the Taliban might find it difficult to digest as to how they are taking loans from the Chinese, antithetical to the Hanafi jurisprudence on loan borrowings. Also, Mohal, a point that you were talking about, Russia has refused to attend the swearing-in or the commencement ceremony. Tajikistan's foreign minister, Shirojuddin Muhriddin, has said that they would only support an Afghan government that includes all ethnic groups, including the Tajiks. He has also said that the Taliban conducted airstrikes on Tajiks in Panjshir with the aid of a third country. Now, obviously, everybody without naming is pointing fingers at Pakistan. And the complaint is quite common when you see all the countries complaining. It's simple that the Taliban does not have an all-inclusive government, does not have women in their cabinet, and the ethnic population might end up becoming unrepresented and might even become victims of specific targets. So I think these are the different dimensions of nation building or administration that the Taliban will face, and every regional power surrounding Taliban will want this to be addressed. However, I think we'll now move on to the India angle, wherein we'll primarily look at it from an Indian perspective. India's ambassador to Qatar, Deepak Mittal, talked with Sher Mohammad Abbas Tanighai, as I already pointed out earlier. He is the head of the Taliban's political office in Doha. This meeting was held at the Indian embassy in Doha, but surprisingly on the request of the Taliban side. And a statement was issued by the External Affairs Ministry to this effect. And that statement, I quote, discussions focused on safety, security, and early return of Indian nationals stranded in Afghanistan. The travel of Afghan nationals, especially minorities who wish to come to India, also came up, the statement said. Now, apparently, Ambassador Mittal also raised India's concern that Afghanistan soil should not be used for anti-Indian activities and terrorism in any manner. Also, the Taliban representative assured the ambassador that these issues would be positively addressed, unquote. So it's kind of obvious that the Taliban also want to talk with India. India is willing to talk with them, although not directly wanting to give them an official status. I think the Indian government is willing to just see where is a common ground, if at all, and see how there can be a channel of communication open. Also, as per a report in Hindustan Times in June, this was before the fall of Kabul, India had for the first time opened channels of communication with several Afghan Taliban factions and leaders, including Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar. The outreach was largely being led by Indian security officials and was limited to Taliban factions and leaders that were perceived as being outside the sphere of influence of Pakistan. Now, this meeting within the Indian embassy, India has acknowledged, this is the first time that India has acknowledged any sort of official contact with the Taliban since the group assumed power in Kabul. Also, Tanighai himself is seen as number 2 in Taliban's negotiating team and third overall among the leaders based in Qatar. He surprisingly was trained for several years at the Indian Military Academy in Dehradun in the early 1980s when he was an officer in the Afghan army. He has apparently taken on a key role in foreign relations, including the Taliban's outreach to countries in the region. Also, the Taliban social media posted a 46-minute video in which Tanighai himself said that the group wants to continue Afghanistan's political, economic, and cultural ties with India. This was the first time a member of Taliban's top hierarchy had spoken on the issue since the takeover of Kabul. Stanik Hai in that video said, I quote, India is very important for the subcontinent. We want to continue our cultural, economic, and trade ties with India like in the past. Trade with India through Pakistan is very important for us. With India, trade through air corridors will also remain open. We give due importance to our political, economic, and trade ties with India, and we want these to continue. We are looking forward to working with India in this regard. Now, all this points to the fact that Taliban is keen to maintain trade ties with India to begin with, and possibly expand it going forward. Now, we have leaders like Stanik Hai and Anas Haqqani who have been engaged in discrete efforts to gauge the thinking in New Delhi towards the group. Both Stanik Hai and Haqqani, part of the group's negotiating team, have also been part of an outreach towards India over the past 1 or 2 weeks. This has resulted in them being seen as the main contact persons for any Taliban contacts with the Indian side in coming days. So you see a lot of things happening under the radar behind the prying eyes of the media. Now, even in a recent interview given to CNN News 18, Taliban leader Anas Haqqani said, Kashmir is not part of our jurisdiction and interference is against our policy. However, in another interview with a Pakistan-based channel, Taliban spokesman Zabiullah Mujahid urged Pakistan and India to sit together to resolve all outstanding issues. Within India too, let's focus to Delhi. Within India too, the government called for an all-party meet on the 26th of August, where the Minister for External Affairs, Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar, briefed all the political parties. He emphasized that the government was following a wait-and-watch policy regarding indulging with the Taliban. However, he also mentioned that the primary focus for the government now was to evacuate religious minorities and those Afghans who had worked on Indian projects or in the Indian embassy and consulates. On the security front, India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval has been working closely with both the US and Russia. On the US side, Doval spoke with CIA Director William Burns, who had flown down to Delhi, but the details of the meeting are not made public. But it's generally believed that the security issue was discussed. On the Russian side, Doval spoke to his Russian counterpart Nikolai Patrushev, and a possible spillover of terror activities to India, Central Asia, and even Russia was discussed. So I think that way it is quite obvious that India is trying to engage as many people both within Taliban and also within the greater region to understand and to discuss and put on the table their red lines and see how to engage with the Taliban in the future. Now, obviously, engaging does not mean giving legitimacy. Legitimacy Taliban will have to earn it, and that obviously will take a lot of time. But for now, Indian government would want to continue engaging with the different factions within Taliban and also with the regional players, so that one way or the other, India will have some amount of leverage within Afghanistan. Now, as much as we are thinking of Kabul now being ruled by Taliban and how to engage with them, it is also essential to understand how Pakistan might use the resurgence of Taliban to send insurgents into Kashmir. Internal security within J&K has been strengthened. There is no doubt about it. We have already covered this in multiple episodes in the past. The line of control has been fenced with regular surveillance with drones and night vision cameras. Moreover, earlier the number of foreign terrorists was quite high in the Jammu and Kashmir state. But over the years, this number has dropped significantly. More importantly, there is some kind of a fatigue for the Kashmiris who have come to realize that it is not worthy to stay behind, to rally behind Pakistan, expecting them to help Kashmiris at the opportune moment. So I think that way, India is kind of covering all its bases. hoping that the backlash of the Taliban taking over Afghanistan will be minimal on itself. Mohal, so with that, do you have any other closing comment before we wind up?
Yeah, I think you very well mentioned that we will have to engage with Taliban, and it doesn't mean giving them legitimacy. We have to discuss what do they want from the relationship and also discuss our red lines in terms of internal security. Though Pakistan will want to use their leverages with various terrorist groups to create trouble in Kashmir for sure. So we'll have to be on the watch out. I think as we had mentioned in the earlier episode, I mean the other point is Pakistan might be celebrating now, but there could be very well a blowback towards their end. As we also mentioned that the Tajikistan, Iran, the Central Asian republics, they all will be watching very carefully because they don't want any blowback from them, especially Pakistan and China, who are supposed to be the new benefactors of the new regime in Kabul. They will also have to wait very carefully. I think China has acknowledged saying that we will wait and watch and invest slowly into not Taliban, slowly into Afghanistan. I mean, because they don't want to be get caught in the quagmire of sort of graveyard of empires that both Russia and now US have gotten themselves into. I mean, as long as their security needs are met, I mean, we can see that even in a place like Pakistan, there could be attacks on Chinese engineers and stuff. So it'll be interesting to see if they would do large scale investments, because that would mean putting Chinese boots on the ground, because I'm not sure how much they would rely on the Taliban to provide security for any investments and stuff. So it'll be interesting days forward for all in the whole neighborhood, Kishore.
Great. Okay, so I think we'll wind up this episode, but before we do that, let's switch our focus to recommendations. Mohal, you have any recommendation for today?
Yeah, so since we are close to the anniversary of 9/11, I think I'll recommend a movie that was loosely based on the story of the first American Special Army, US Army Special Forces that was sent to Afghanistan immediately after the September 11 attacks. It's called 12 Strong. It's about this detachment of 12 soldiers who goes in the very early days of the war against Taliban. And interestingly, they are accompanied by General Dostum, like a Uzbek general, was part of the Northern Alliance. It stars Chris Hemsworth, and it was interesting movie. Some of the dialogues also is that, oh, one day you will be here and one day you will be gone, So the Dostum says to the Americans, which have been proven to be so true, one day you are our enemy and the other day you are our friend, sort of thing. Sure. What's your recommendation for this week?
Yeah, so I read a fascinating article by Abhinav Pandya on the National Interest portal. It's titled "The Pakistan Connection: How ISKP became Islamabad's latest proxy." And it talks about Pakistan's double game of keeping up the pretense of being a US ally while sheltering, funding, and training terror groups with the same US aid money that they got. And he goes on to say that the strategy of Pakistan is most likely to continue. That was a fascinating article that I read, and I would like to recommend that for today. Okay, so to continue hearing about such topics, we would urge you listeners to subscribe to our channel, India Rising, wherever you are listening to us. If you are listening to us on YouTube, please press the bell icon to get notifications about new episodes. If you have not left us a review, we urge you to do so, as it helps other listeners like you in finding us. We would also like to hear from you if you have any suggestions on any topics that you would like us to cover. Do remember that these topics should be directly related to Indian foreign policy. Until the next time, this is Mohal and Kishor signing off.